Welcome to the Rabble Report. I'm Joseph.
And I'm Grant. Today, we've got a lot to cover, a lot of international chaos over the last month that we really are eager to put into context. South Korea declared and swiftly ended martial law. There's a disputed election in Romania, overturned because of alleged Russian interference. Protests in the country of Georgia as the ruling party appoints an anti-Western former footballer to the presidency. Irish elections went in a surprising direction, and not to mention in Syria, a coalition of Islamist militant groups have deposed President Bashar al-Assad after almost 14 years of civil war. That's a pretty long list, isn't it?
The wheels of history have turned quite a bit in the last 2 weeks, actually, I would say.
So let's start with South Korea.
So the right-wing president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol, who has been dealing with corruption problems and nosediving approval ratings for a while, decided to declare martial law and within hours wound up retracting it, and now is being subject to impeachment attempts. One has failed, and the next one looks like it might succeed because it looks like his own party is starting to give way on him.
Right. By the time this is out, he might be impeached. Interesting that he wasn't impeached the first time around. Speaks to a mutual weakness on both sides.
Even the last election did too. The last South Korean election seemed like a battle between unpopular populisms.
Two forms of populism that are actually quite unpopular.
Yoon won against Lee Jae-myung, who is a leftish member of the previous governing party, the Democratic Party of Korea. Yoon himself was mostly known as a hard-ass prosecutor who went after multiple politicians in South Korean politics. And of course, his opponent, Lee, has, quite a few skeletons under his closet himself. It can actually be incredibly difficult to keep track of all the skeletons in South Korean politics. It's almost like the East Asian version of New Jersey. It's impossible to keep track of the number of scandals going on. It seems like everybody's paying somebody off, misappropriating funds somewhere, got their kid into college in an unsavory way, and the country's judiciary seems heavily politically weaponized in that sense.
Yoon's approval rating is now 15%, and it's not like it was good. What was he struggling with before this happened?
I think in general, he struggled with multiple scandals, for one, including involving his wife. But at the same time, that's very par for the course in South Korea. Again, because it has such a heavily weaponized judiciary against its politicians. What happened recently, too, is that there were parliamentary elections that pretty much stymied any sort of reform. Apparently, his Minister of Defense wanted to provoke an attack from North Korea as a pretext for the coup as well.
The pretext for the coup was that there were North Korean infiltrators in the opposition.
It's such a crackpot scheme to me. I think Yoon is somebody that didn't understand why he got elected. I think he was basically elected as a negation of the former government. He basically governed as a maybe somewhat crankish right-wing politician. One that was as crooked as the rest of them were, marred with scandal, that couldn't respond to the economic issues that Korea was having. So he got flooded out with the parliamentary election this year. I think he launched this as a sort of desperate gambit that he had drawn up previously for whatever reason. Politicians, though, can be always prone to overreaching, really. This just seems like a particularly disastrous and humiliating one.
On the subject of overreach, or potential overreach anyway, why don't we talk about Romania?
Oh, yes.
So, what happened in Romania? Basically, we had Kalin Georgescu. He won the election.
It was a first round between him and Elena Lasconi, but I think that even makes it crazier. They negated the first round.
The reason they negated this first round is because of a Russian interference campaign benefiting Georgescu.
There were some whispers of vote buying and ballot stuffing. I mean, that's typical Eastern European stuff, really, unfortunately. But it is quite interesting, like how nakedly they sort of overreached just on the notion of disinformation. I mean, I guess it's technically legal because I guess that's how European laws work now. But I don't know if I've seen anything like this yet. Just the idea that you can overturn election results just on the notion of foreign intervention, disinformation, et cetera, et cetera.
I was reading this article in the Journal of Democracy, which is published by Johns Hopkins University Press, but funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which was created by Congress and is thought to be involved in U.S. foreign intelligence in some ways. So you're getting a intelligence community informed perspective, I'll say, in the Journal of Democracy. It says the Romanian government is trying to guard against Russian election interference, but such a drastic, unexpected, and last-minute move risks undermining people's faith in democracy. So there's a lot of concern throughout the article that for Moscow, maybe it's a win-win. You either get a sympathetic politician into office, or you've completely discredited the democratic institutions of Romania. At what point are you allowed to declare your voters and the public just too uninformed for democracy to take place? I mean, that's quite bold.
Right, and the thing is too, I think they used Georgescu's. He was massively underpolled. Actually, he actually made it into the first round, and he didn't really register getting anywhere near the first round in polling. So that came as a shock. I even wonder if that's like what people were seeing with Trump early. The idea that he brought out all these low propensity voters that the polls were not picking up because he was going through all these non-traditional media to reach out to voters. A lot of them working class, a lot of them farmers, disaffected, et cetera, et cetera.
The idea that because there are false things said on the internet, people's votes don't count anymore is concerning.
It's interesting too, though, that for once we're hearing about overreach on this type of thing. Meanwhile, the United States is probably going to ban TikTok unless the Trump administration decides to intervene on that. I don't know if he will. He said he would, but we'll see what happens. But in the last 10 years, how often have you seen, I don't know, Western liberals say, actually, maybe we shouldn't step on the gas pedal too hard on censoring people? That seems new to me.
The ambivalence I'm seeing about it, though, seems to be about public backlash and realpolitik type consequences.
Oh, it is. Sure, it is. I'm just curious. I haven't seen that in years. I wouldn't have registered 5 years ago. Definitely wouldn't have registered a couple of years ago either.
There's never any questioning, well, why would these ideas have resonance? It's treated like people are just robots and that they're just following a programming that's coming from another country. And there are things said that aren't true, but there's not a lot of curiosity with incidents like this about the reasons for the resonance. You'd have to start thinking about things that are more reasonable than Russian disinformation, because maybe what the Russians are saying isn't true, but I bet you there's some corruption people are upset about.
Right. I mean, I think part of this is because you have to think of how the political class sees information and how they see media. It's as you said, they see it as a brainwashing mechanism rather than that media just plays on people's pre-existing notions. And the more effective media plays the best on the pre-existing notions. The way that they're going after Georgescu, I think, firms up my opinion that he's probably going to get elected. It was probably more ambiguous before this, but I think that this only makes a bigger anti-politician out of him because he definitely sounds like a right-wing kook, and he definitely has this tendency of unpopular populism in him.
But they're lending him the power of anti-politics just by doing this.
Right. If you're treating him like this, he has to be disruptive in some way, and he has played on that in his campaigns. Neither of the main two candidates, Lasconi or Georgescu, were from the main Romanian parties. Lasconi is actually an anti-corruption, pro-European centrist. I'm sure that had salience as to why she would get elected because of how dirty Romanian politics are. I think the question with somebody like this, though, is how disruptive will they really be in power? There probably is some degree of war exhaustion in Europe and among the European public because the war has obviously created huge economic problems and it's creating security issues. And it doesn't seem like the European political establishment has any way out.
Which is actually a good transition into talking about Georgia, I think.
Agreed, yes.
So where are things at in Georgia right now? They've been having protests since late November. The ruling party, Georgian Dream, claimed victory in October's elections for parliament. And then last month, they delayed entry into the EU. And that is what initially set off these mass rallies in Georgia. This is further being exacerbated by the fact that under constitutional amendments passed in 2017, The president of Georgia, who used to be directly elected, is now elected by an electoral college. And the ruling party, because they won the parliamentary elections, is in a position to appoint the next president. And they've chosen a former footballer, or soccer for us Americans. His orientation is considered right wing and he leans towards Russia. That election in October was disputed by the opposition to some extent. The current president, Zorabishvili, doesn't intend to recognize the next president as legitimate. So there's a presidential election crisis. There's a crisis about whether to enter the EU. What do you make of it?
It's very common to have mass protests in Georgia. I mean, how many times has that happened in the last 20 years? You had the Rose Revolution protests in 2019. You had protests last year. You have these protests. I'm probably missing at least one protest wave. Georgian politics are extremely partisan and corrupt and ugly and prone to power grabbing. This presidential reform is even a good example, really. And I do wonder how much the Georgian Green government is overplaying its hand by shoving off European accession talks for, what was it, 4 years, 5 years? The thing is, when you look at polling, both NATO membership and EU membership are very popular in Georgia. And it makes sense that Georgia would want to be integrated into the West economically, given that they haven't had real relations with Russia for the last 15 years, that they'd want to be under an outside party's security belt. I guess that leaves a question of what gets the Georgian Dream elected constantly in the last 10 years, because they've been the ruling party for a while.
And Georgian Dream is not seen as pro-West.
Right. And can you really blame it entirely on ballot stuffing, vote buying, intimidation? I don't know about that.
There have to be people in Georgia who support joining the EU and who support Georgian Dream, which doesn't support joining the EU.
Georgian Dream came in as a sort of clearing out of Saakashvili's political party, which again got dogged with with corruption issues, accusations of concentrating power, police brutality against protests. Again, this stuff happens in Georgia like every 5 years at least. So they kind of rode in on that. Not too much on like Viktor Orban in Hungary. The opposition in Georgia hasn't really been coherent or credible in any way. I think only 13% of Georgians trust their political parties. That's quite incredible, really.
You have 13% of Georgians trust their political parties. You have 39% distrust. And then you have 46% neither trust nor distrust. But if you're saying you neither trust nor distrust someone, I don't think you trust them.
Getting back to Hungary, because I mean, Orban gets painted quite often as the sort of quasi-dictatorial figure, but I think the truth is with somebody like him is that he's simply been able to float for as long as he has because there has never been credible opposition to him in Hungarian politics since he got elected in 2010 until recently, when actually an anti-corruption party has emerged and has been catching up with them in the polls. I think that actually it might be what Georgia is really lacking right now. I don't think they have credible opposition that can sort of like float above the mire and dirtiness and partisanship.
Georgians polled in 2023, 65% fully support joining NATO, and then an additional 15% somewhat support it. 75% support fully joining the EU, and then 14% somewhat support joining the EU.
And it actually makes sense too. I mean, Russia's occupying like 20% of Georgian territory and has been for the last 15 years. But I think that also gets perhaps that might even get an aspect of why Georgian Dream does have some cachet in spite of everything still. Maybe being willing to triangulate with the Russians is seen as an alternative to war, especially after what happened in 2022 with Ukraine. And granted, Zelensky tried to pull off the the neutralist position and it didn't work. But I don't think it's comparable because of how Putin received Zelensky as an anti-politician and because of how tight up Russia is right now. I think George and Dream might actually be in a pretty precarious position if they don't maybe step off the gas pedal a little bit.
You've actually given us another good transition, talking about Russia being tied up in Ukraine. You have the fall of the Syrian regime.
It does make sense in a retrospect. Iran is obviously distracted right now. Hezbollah got its teeth knocked out by the Israelis. Russia's very distracted. Assad very clearly was attenuated deeply. Even the groups that supposedly were his bulwarks don't seem that sad to see him go.
It's been a 14-year civil war where ultimately Assad was propped up by foreign powers. While those foreign powers might not have necessarily wanted him to fall, when you have a proxy who is utterly dependent like that, they're a problem for you in a sense that you've got to constantly keep funded.
Right. And I also mean, too, just the extent to which, I don't know, the Alawites, Syrian Christians, they don't seem like particularly weeping over the fall of Assad.
I'm sure there's nervousness, right? This Syrian opposition that's toppled Assad is a group called HTS. HTS is sort of a rebrand for these Islamist militants who split from Al Qaeda. And things have really turned around for the rebel groups since their darkest days in 2019. There's still a difficult coalition, but centralizing more under HTS. And then, to your point, HTS has been trying to play nice about minorities and made a lot of pledges there. Whether they'll hold to that, especially al-Jilani does not have a clean record in the past when he was with al-Qaeda on this at all.
I guess the question is, can he be the al-Sadr of Syria?
Right away, everyone identified that you have Turkey right on the border of Syria, and they consider the Kurdish groups, the PKK, terrorists. So I wonder about the governance issues that are going to arise, because that's not the only problem they have, and that's a pretty big one. So we'll have to see if they end up actually governing, or if being in a perpetual war ends up being more convenient in almost a Hamas-like way. It's hard for me to picture either of those.
Here's the thing, I don't think they have the juice for it. I really don't. That's actually something I was thinking about too with Assad. The fact that he crumbled so spectacularly, nobody put up a defense. But at the same time, it was actually a pretty small band of militants that routed the Syrian army.
I think there's a lot of fatigue with the war.
Exactly. Who actually wants to fight anymore in Syria? It's not that I think it won't necessarily fracture, because I think that's very possible, but I think it would be probably a fairly anticlimactic, low intensity, quasi frozen conflict type of thing. I think all sides of politics in Syria are actually pretty exhausted right now. I don't think there's anybody with real credibility in the sense of, pick up a gun and fight for me.
This war killed so many people.
It killed 500,000 people. It's hard to see who seems credible here, really. I think actually the only way Jelani can really uphold authority is by being a peacemaker.
He seems to grasp that now.
Mm-hmm.
The question is,
Can he?
can he?
I don't know. I honestly don't. This has regional implications too. Is Israel going to go into Lebanon again, for instance? Hezbollah is pretty crippled. They don't have a logistical train through Syria to Iran, and their leadership got decapitated. There are rumblings in Israel that this is a 1 in 50-year opportunity to secure their regional power. But maybe that's an overreach, potentially, too, if they did that. This is a very up in the air topic, I think. A lot of questions, a lot of moving parts. But I do think it relates to anti-politics in the sense you will definitely see a sort of exhaustion in Syria amongst the public in terms of, backing in an active way any faction in politics that wants to go to war.
In Damascus, there seemed to be a lot of celebration in the streets.
I don't moralize too much when it comes to this stuff, but Assad is legitimately a monster. He was a terrible guy.
Who couldn't even stand on his own 2 feet.
That's the worst kind of monster, isn't it? A weak one.
There's an interesting quote in this Washington Post article. Even in Damascus, the newcomers are still mostly unknown. At a store selling freshly printed Syrian revolutionary flags Wednesday, shopkeeper Fadi al-Musli couldn't name the country's new prime minister, Mohammed al-Bashir, appointed by HTS this week. Whoever he is, quote, "We don't want him," he said, quote, "We want elections."
I love that.
They're claiming there's going to be elections.
We'll see, I guess. I mean, I guess that's sort of the summary with Syria. We'll see, but I think anti-politics does give you a little bit of a framework as to predict where the public is at right now. Exhausted, aloof, but they also want to assert their own power somehow. I mean, what better way to prevent a war or tyranny than an election? This seems less to be a sort of social uprising than a collapse of an old political order that had rotted out and wasn't being propped up anymore from the outside. I don't think Assad's going to go down well historically.
So, you wanted to talk about Ireland a bit?
A little bit. Here's an interesting article. It's all about how Ireland avoided a far-right surge and anti-incumbent backlash in recent elections.
What do you think is going on in Ireland? Because there's this narrative that has emerged that there is some sign of hope for establishment parties in Ireland. Do you really think that's the case? I don't.
No, I think it's an illusion, really. If elections are like a brief snapshot in time, I think we're kind of seeing a dead cat bounce here, really. November 29th, there was an election held in Ireland, and it appears that the classic main political parties since Irish independence, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, are going to wind up in coalition either with more conservative independents or one of the myriad center-left parties, Labour, the Greens. But them working together, these two parties, is actually quite recent. They first went into coalition together in 2020. It was considered historic.
That doesn't really read to me like a thundering success.
The opposition, it's interesting. For a while, Sinn Féin, the historical political arm of the Irish Republican Army, formerly considered a terrorist group, was actually leading in polls for the first time in history. And they were sort of riding on backlash against rising housing costs in Ireland, which, that does sound like an international issue right now. That's haunted a lot of incumbents. But a couple things have happened more recently that have undermined their position. One is the emergence of multiple right-wing anti-immigration independents that have fragmented the sort of nationalist base that Sinn Féin has always relied on historically, even though it's a ostensibly left-wing party. So you see that fragmentation, and they've also been hit with scandal. So I think what happened here is that you can probably call it an unpopular populist surge of one party wound up sort of fizzling and fragmenting in a way that allowed the establishment to sort of claw its way back.
But just barely so.
But just barely so, yeah. Be skeptical of any return of the establishment narratives that you're going to be hearing about. Biden was supposed to be FDR, remember?
Yeah, I don't think the problems are going away for that.
No, and Sinn Féin might even be able to do a comeback if they're smart about it, if they clean house, or maybe somebody else emerges. Who knows?
All of this feels very symptomatic in different ways of the breakdown of politics.
No, I agree. You see overreach leading to disastrous results. You see overreach that will be undermining in the long run. You see fragmentation,
exhaustion.
All these symptoms of anti-politics, really.
Anyway, thank you for joining us on the Rabble Report. If you like what we're doing, or you don't like what we're doing, you can actually still like and subscribe even if you hated this. We appreciate you.
And now I knew if I had my chains, that I could make those people dance, and maybe they'd be happy for a while. February made me shiver with the paper I deliver. Bad news on the doorstep. I couldn't take one more step. I can't remember if I tried when I read about his willow bride. Something touched me deep inside the day the music died.